Okay, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Friday, July 1st of 2022. Happy July and happy 4th of July weekend to everybody out there. If this is your first time watching Office Hours, my name's Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and this show is an open Q&A style show where I answer questions we get from the SaberSim community about how to use SaberSim to build better DFS lineups. So if you have questions you'd like me to answer here, fire away at me live in YouTube chat. You can email us, support@sabersim.com, or you can post questions in the Office Hours channel in Slack. There's a link to join the Slack community in the description of every past show. So definitely get joined up there if you haven't already. We have a few questions in our queue here for today already about ordering your lineups as they go into your contest, ranking your lineups as they go into your contest. We'll probably start there. I saw a question about mitigating weather risk in your lineups, and also one about making groups in MMA. So we will start with those three here in just a moment. But as always, again, if you have questions for me, go ahead and get them in the queue now. Fire away at me. We'll answer questions in about the order that they came in. But going to start with a good one from Tim, a constant question in the world of DFS. I think something that all DFS players have always agonized about at some point or the other. And he said, how do I know which lineups to put into my single entry and 3 max contests? For example, last night, my top line in the mini max would have won all of those other contests. I'm sure this happens to a lot of people, and there is no easy answer. But I'm just wondering if there is a way to improve the odds that my best lineup ends up in a single entry or 3 max. If only, Tim, if only there was a way to know, we could all be making a lot more money here if we could put our lineups in the contest beforehand where they would be the mathematically most profitable position. There isn't an easy answer here. There are a couple answers that I think can help. There are things that can kind of help, I think, give you maybe squeeze out a few extra points of EV. But it's always going to be, this is always kind of a constant challenge in DFS. I mean, one thing to note here is that, if you are playing, I don't know, if you are playing 200 entries, right, and you are playing 150 into the mini max and 40 into another set of 20 maxes, or another pair of 20 maxes, and then 10 additional lineups are played into single entry and 3 maxes, right? Well, 5% of your total lineups are entered into those single entry and 3 maxes. So just mathematically speaking, the odds that your best overall scoring lineup is going to end up in a single entry contest, where likely the number one overall lineup in that contest is much lower than it is in the mini max, is just low, right? Like there's just the raw probabilities are just low that you're going to kind of get everything that fits exactly where it should. And in fact, I mean, the randomness about all of that means this is probably going to work out in your favor about as often as it's going to work out not in your favor, right? You'll probably notice more often when you're like, you could look any night and be like, man, if this one lineup in the mini max was in the chin music, I would have taken that contest down or something like that. But what you won't notice is when you have a lineup that is, in the mini max might not even have cashed, or would have just had a middling performance, but because it ended up in the chin music, it ended up finishing top 20, and you 5x or 6x on that lineup, right? So it does work out in your favor sometimes too. But a couple quick things about like ways that I think you can, improve your odds, I guess, or ways that you can you can squeeze out a little bit more here. If you are building a big pool of lineups here on SaberSim, so let's do this here. And, maybe you're playing 200, and let's give ourselves a little bit of a bigger pool here to work with, right? One thing to note here is that Saber score is already intended to be a quantification. Is that a word? That felt weird coming out of my mouth. Saber score is meant to quantify the upside of a lineup or the strength of a lineup already, right? So if you want to, at least it almost feels like due diligence to me. I wouldn't say it's going to end up with like a very measurable difference filling by Saber score with a unique rank fill method, but I do think it can make you feel a little bit better about it, putting your highest Saber score lineups into the highest dollar contest that you're playing, right? So then at least if if you had a great lineup in the mini-max and it would have banked a $10 single entry, a $25 single entry, something like that, well, it would have never ended up in that contest because it wasn't in your top 10 SaberScore lineups anyway, right? So when you come in here, and I don't have an entries file for tonight. I actually maybe I should have gone back to yesterday here. I think I actually, well, that's fine. I think I can still demonstrate the point, right? So we've got these lineups, right? And we can fill these here using the unique rank fill method, once this cooperates with me, such that, let's say again, so you're playing 200 lineups, right? Such that lineup 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 through 10 are all going into those single entry contests. They are all the highest SaberScore lineups possible. Then your lineups, 11 through, what would that be? 51 in the case if you had 20 max contests, all go into the 20 max contests. And then the mini max contests are your remaining 150, right? And then that at least based on SaberScore, which attempts to quantify the strength of the lineup by looking at ownership, the projection, and the correlation of those teams, you put your best foot forward. And I think that's probably the best way to give you the biggest chance of having your best actual scoring lineup in the single entry contests where the Bink score would be the lowest, and you have the greatest opportunity to kind of realize your edge there. One thing to note, one thing to be careful of here, and to just show this point, I'm going to simplify our pool down to just the top 10 lineups. If you are going to make a lot of adjustments to exposures and things like that to your lineup pool, if you do that, you will create your exposures will not be even throughout your entire pool. So let's say we're looking at this here, for example, and we say we don't want to have 100% Arizona, and we change this to 50, right? If we look at what happens to the top 10 lineups here, so we have 5 Arizona stacks now, but in the first 5 lineups, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, all 5 of our first lineups are Arizona stacks. Then lineups 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are not Arizona stacks. So if you make a lot of adjustments to your exposures and you fill using the unique rank fill method to put your highest SaberScore lineups first into your highest dollar entry limit contests, you should be aware that this can happen, where you may only have 50% exposure to Arizona stacks over the course of your entire portfolio, but 100% of the first 20 lineups in your pool are all Arizona stacks. So be aware of that. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. When you fill with unique random, you are letting randomness decide what lineup goes into what contest. And there's kind of a, something that you have to accept with that. If you are filling with unique rank, you have to understand that your exposures to any one player may not be evenly distributed throughout all of your contests, and you have to accept that. So there's a bit of a trade-off on either side, but hopefully that kind of helps. Let me know if there's any follow-up questions there. And let's move on here. I want to hit this question from Average Tuesday. I think this is a really interesting one here. So this is actually something I used to do a lot. And the question says, when thinking about weather risk and wanting to ensure teams in risky games are either full stacked or nothing, is there a quick way to ensure there aren't one-offs from risky games sprinkled throughout the other lineups after removing those teams from the mini stacks? So talking about, weather mitigation in your lineups, basically here. And the theory behind this, I think this is a pretty cool idea, right? Is that, when a game has weather risk, the creating lineups that only stack those teams, only using stacks of those teams, basically allows you to still take advantage of the high upside outcome when that game plays, and a 5-stack of a team playing in that game is optimal, without letting the downside of that game pollute other lineups, right? So I know there are quite a few weather games here today. So for example, I think, let's see. Okay, so KC and Detroit, and it looks like New York and Cleveland. So we'll use KC and Detroit. That looks like the riskiest game here. So KC and Detroit. So we have some KC lineups here we have some KC lineups in our pool here, right? So basically the idea here, and I just think it's an interesting thing to talk about. So I'll kind of explain the way I think about this first, because I used to do a lot of this as well, is that, KC has there's still upside in this game, right? And you still want to take advantage of a situation where the game plays and look like, okay, so this is a perfect example. It's a KC Detroit game stack, right? Like if this game goes off, right? It doesn't matter if this game doesn't play for this lineup in particular, because it's as if there's no difference between this game not playing and this lineup just not being, and this game just not going off. Excuse me. And this game just not going off, right? From a payout standpoint, this game getting postponed after lock and not being able to do anything about it is exactly the same as this game having a final score of 4-2, right? Doesn't matter. But what you don't really want to do, or what you maybe want to avoid sometimes, is a situation where maybe you just play a Bobby Witt Jr. one-off, where there's probably some other player that's very closely projected to Bobby Witt. He has a very similar upside, but Bobby Witt has this significant additional downside risk that you just don't need to take on. So the question is, how do you only full stack the teams in weather games and avoid one-offs and mini stacks throwing off your mojo, right? So what I would do is first, and I think Average Tuesday already mentioned that he did this. So first, figure out what games you want to look at. So, maybe let's just, for now, since there's so many weather games on tonight's slate, let's just focus just on the KC and Detroit game. So what I would do is I would go through and I would look for the little stacks of that game and make sure you eliminate any 3 stacks or 2 stacks or any versions of that game that are not the full stacked version. So there's Detroit 3 stack. Let's eliminate that. Okay. Give that a second to update. KC and Detroit looks good. Now we have a 2 stack of Detroit. Let's get them out of there as well. Okay. And cool. Looks good. Okay. But now the problem is how can we find our one-offs, right? Are there any one-offs that are interfering here, right? So what I would do now instead is I would look for, basically, I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, show me all lineups that don't have a Detroit 3 stack, that don't have a KC 3 stack, and that don't have a Detroit 2 stack, and that don't have a KC 2 stack. And actually, wait. No, this is easier. As I'm talking through this, there's an easier way to do this. We can just do this as the stacks in general. So let's get rid of these. So basically, I would say, so this filter is showing you every lineup that doesn't have that magnifying glass with the negative sign. So we can say, show me all lineups that don't have a KC stack at all. Show me all lineups that don't have a Detroit stack at all, and check to see if you have any exposure to these teams. So we have no Detroit and no KC. So that looks good. But hypothetically, let's say we said, show me all lineups that don't have a stack of either of these 2 teams, and we had 5% exposure to Bobby Witt amongst these. That would mean we have a Bobby Witt one-off somewhere, and we could go find that lineup. We could filter by Bobby Witt, find that lineup, and eliminate from our pool. So does that make sense? So you can use these filters to basically show you all lineups that do not have a stack of the team in question here, and check to see if you have any one-off exposure anywhere else, and then manually eliminate those teams from your pool. For what it's worth, I used to do something very similar to this, and I found it really time consuming. And I think, I don't know how much value it adds compared to just eliminating the game, right? If the game is an elite hitting environment, I think it makes some sense. But that is a different question. So, but that is how I would go about doing that. All right. Cool. Good question here from Eagles. Let's talk about this one here. And he said, do you make groups for your fighters in MMA contests? I think this is an interesting idea, especially combined with what Max was talking about when he was on this stream the other day. So we had Max on Tuesday. Let's see. It's up here in our office hours playlist. Yeah. So Max came on here on Tuesday and talked a little bit about what he's been doing for his MMA process recently, mostly as it relates to, finding combinations of players that might be pretty popular together, looking for lineups that have a combination of a very high salary and a very high total ownership sum, and eliminating them to avoid duplication. I'll answer this question this way. I haven't been making groups in MMA because a lot of what I do in my process is I will adjust player projections down to kind of additionally adjust for ownership, right? So I will adjust a player down or up if I think that that adjustment to their projection will help make me get more unique lineups overall in my portfolio. But I do think it's an interesting idea to, I think it can be an interesting idea or a different way of doing this to figure out what are going to be the most popular lineup pairings in the slate that particular week and make groups to avoid those combinations of players together, right? 13 fight card here, 26 overall fighters. There's going to be a lot of duplication even on somewhat of a bigger card like this. So I think here's how I would think about going down that route is I would want to get an idea of like, what are the easiest lineup constructions to make, right? Let's just look at like the top 500 cash lineups, even just with SaberSim projections, and see what kind of combinations are are most commonly included together. What are the combinations of fighters that are going to be, paired more often together than their raw probability would indicate? And actually, you know what? So let's turn off allow opposing fighters because we want to mimic, I think, what people are actually going to do in GPPs, and I don't think most people are going to fight stack in GPPs. So let's turn that off and rebuild here. Okay, and let's start kind of taking a look at this lineup. So Barbarina, right, looks to be like one of those elite value plays here. Let's add the win odds as well so we can see this. Right, okay. So probably overall, kind of like the preferred value play showing up in almost every single cash game lineup we have in the first 500 here, right? And then we've got O'Malley, Holloway, Duplessis, Volkanovski, right? You can kind of get an idea of what these constructions start to look like here. And going over here, right? You can even use these filters to get an idea of how do fighters get paired together, right? Assuming you take Holloway, what are the most common pairings? What are the easiest pairings to make? Barbarina and O'Malley, right? And then let's go look here. Let's go look at the other side of that fight and ask on Volkanovski, right? If Volkanovski wins, what are the most common pairings here? Barbarina, Duplessis here. And I think you could kind of start taking some notes here and figure out, pairings that you maybe want to avoid, right? These pairings, because of the salary and the projections and things like that, they are too easy to combine together, right? And I think you could kind of start to come up with a little bit of a group here where maybe you're saying, of this, maybe even just this like first, depending on the size of your contest, maybe of just this group of like these first 5 fighters here. Obviously in a GPP, you're probably not playing Holloway and Volkanovski together anyway. So it's really like one or the other of these guys, and then maybe just one additional one of these guys of these other additional kind of chalky plays. So you could come over and then make a group and basically say, right, these are also probably the highest owned guys, right? Yeah. So, and take something like this and say max 2. Oops. And then when you're building your GPP lineups, you're going to naturally like just basically throw out all of those lineups. I think it's at least a starting point. I would still, recommend combing through your lineups and doing a little bit more beyond this. But I do think this is pretty interesting as a starting point of just figuring out like what is the easiest, most cash-friendly lineup construction that most people are going to do. And let's just eliminate all of those lineups right out of the gate. And maybe that's it in this case. Maybe it's some combination. It's like some kind of 3 or 4 of those fighters that we were just looking at, right? Too easy to make on their own, right? And now we can go ahead and look here. And it's going to force some like lower owned constructions in here, right? And when we look at a guy like Holloway, right, we are pairing him in a way that is probably not very common compared to what the field's going to do. So that said, I haven't really actually explored doing this that much in my personal process. Again, I mentioned when we started this year, what I typically end up doing is I build that big research build to start. That in the case of MMA, it's 0, 0, 10, 1500 lineups. Get familiar with the leverage opportunities, the ownership inefficiencies on that card across the board. And then I will make a ton of adjustments to player projections if I think they're going to be higher or lower owned, which generally pushes me in the direction of being more unique anyway. But I think this would be a good opportunity, if you weren't doing research builds, or if you just want kind of a quicker way to just eliminate a really popular construction from your pool. I think it's an interesting idea for sure. So yeah, I like it. Cool. Okay. And then a question from U4 in Slack here about tennis. It says, for tennis, do you still run a research build 0, 0, 10 to see who it shows the most like you do in MLB? Yeah, I probably would. I haven't had a chance to really dive into tennis as much this week as I wanted to. I've played a few slates. I have experimented with some of the research builds here just to see where there are some inefficiencies. I will say, so let's run one together and just take a quick look and see for today what we're getting. So one thing, I put a video out on YouTube yesterday called How to Beat Tennis DFS. And one of the things I talked about in that video are Vegas money lines. And one of the notes I made is that, most tennis projection models, SaberSim included for the time being, are using Vegas money lines as a primary input and basically treating it as gospel and saying this is the true win probability of a particular player, particular match, right? And what that means is actually, I think a lot of industry projections around the industry here are going to be pretty similar. So because of that, I think running a research build for tennis, you're going to see probably smaller leverage opportunities than you might in other sports. In other words, our ownership projections are going to kind of assume that our ownership projections and our optimal rates are all going to be kind of efficient because everybody's kind of treating the Vegas money lines as gospel, right? As fact. And there's still a huge edge to be had building lineups with SaberSim for tennis DFS, because basically what we have that, other tools out there don't have is this, right? And understanding that for a player whose average projection is 43.4, the ranges of outcomes actually look like this, and pulling these outcomes in dynamically, right? That's still very valuable. But I think it's harder to find ownership inefficiencies if both the ownership and the sims assume that the Vegas money line is right. So with that said, I think it's still interesting as a way to understand the slate and get familiar. But I think the better value at the moment is to actually spend some time researching the matches on that particular slate and see if you can find any reason to believe that there's an inefficient or a bad money line out there for Vegas. And I mean, for Wimbledon, the markets are going to be much more liquid. There's going to be a lot more movement, and I think the lines are going to be sharper. But as we move along and start talking about tennis DFS for some smaller events and things like that, that's not really going to be as much the case. And I think there are going to be situations where you can actually add value with your own research, right? Like if we're looking at this, it may be true that hang on, let me give an example here. So if Djokovic's win probability is truly 95%, and, based on his salary and everything else, then, his optimal rate is 35% in DFS lineups, and his ownership is 35% in DFS lineups. And therefore it's efficient ownership. There's not really any way to get an edge. It's approximately optimal to roster him in 35% of your lineups. But if this number is actually 0.9, and everybody thinks it's 0.95, that's an opportunity. Then all of a sudden both of these numbers are wrong, right? And the true value is 28% or 25% or whatever it would end up being. So I think the theory of a research build still works absolutely for tennis, but I think because of kind of the way that the industry works for this particular sport and how heavily those money lines are featured in every projection model out there, I think your best opportunity to add a little bit of value is to research the slate and see if you can find a reason to believe that a particular player is getting under or overvalued based on your research. And I gave an example in that video too from yesterday's slate where I thought, and I actually didn't even follow up to see what happened in this match, but I thought that Golubic was undervalued against Krychkova based on their history of playing on grass and how the first round had gone and things like that. And I'm still familiarizing myself with tennis DFS overall, but there's a lot of different ways to go out there and research these matches and find an opportunity to make some adjustments. So, but good question. Cool. Jumping over to YouTube chat here. Jimmy said, for the single entry and 3-max contest, I would usually submit the 1 to 2 highest SaberSim lineups from Saber score lineups from my pool, and then the 1 to 2 with the highest leverage, because if that hits, oh boy. Yeah, I think that's a great approach as well. The main thing, like if you can give yourself a reason, this is a mental thing. This is not a mathematical thing, but if you can give yourself a reason to say, I played these lineups into my single entry because of this, you will alleviate some stress when those lineups are not your highest scoring lineups, because then at least you can kind of fall back and say, no, I mean, I made that choice, or my process leads me to putting those lineups into that contest. Or you just, let the DFS gods take over and embrace the unique random, which is what I've started doing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I think it's pretty random anyway. So, and then Guy Will Gamble said, also, I believe postponed players can usually be swapped if the game didn't start. So I wouldn't worry about it now either. The exception there would be if that game status is not decided by the time the lock of that game comes around. So like tonight, if let's pull this back up. If KC and Detroit, right, we'll just keep using that example, right? So it's 5-10 game, my time here, right? So maybe that game starts in a rain delay, right? Well, if 5-10 goes by and that game is in a rain delay, all of those players will lock. And if it later postpones during the delay or after the delay, there's no opportunity to get them out. So there are situations sometimes where I know if the game hasn't locked yet. So like, let's say, what's the other game with rain concerns tonight? Are there any later games? I don't know. Let's just say hypothetically, for example, that Baltimore and Minnesota had rain concerns as well, which I don't know if it does. I don't think it does. And this game postpones like right at lock or something like that. Often what DraftKings will do is push the unofficial start time of that game in the app back all the way to whatever the last locking game of the night is. But I don't think it's reliable that you can get out. I wouldn't play every weather game just because you're assuming necessarily that you can get out of any weather situations if they come up, because there's not always a good opportunity. So, and then 6 said, I'm certain I missed it, but any quick tips or a summary of how to use SaberSim for MMA aside from just running and trusting the sims? Actually, 6, what I would recommend, I would check out 2 resources here. So on Tuesday, Max came onto this stream here and broke down his actual MMA process that he's been using this season. And that is up on our YouTube channel here on the catch up on the latest office hours live streams. He breaks down, how he goes through. It basically, in summary, he kind of looks through each individual lineup and compares the total lineup ownership and the total salary to look for situations where there's maybe a few lineups that might be very heavily duplicated. And I also would recommend checking out this video here with Will. Crush MMA DFS with the Power of Sims. This came out right after we published our simulations here. This is a much longer video, and this goes pretty into detail on what goes into our simulations and also how to add some value. So I check out those resources. I think if I can summarize MMA overall, I would say some of the highest value work that you can do within SaberSim is finding lineups that are likely to be duplicated and remove them from your pool. Or finding lineups, more specifically, finding lineups that are more likely to be duplicated than their chance of that lineup being the optimal and removing those from your pool. SaberSim, What SaberSim does a very good job of handling for you is understanding the ranges of outcomes of each fighter and building you lineups that have an upside condition that are likely to be optimal. That the value add is identifying which of those lineups the field is also very likely to spot. So, all right. HC said, would you use unique random to fill a single entry or MME for cash games? And is a default of 500 a good number for cash game builds? So for cash games, I would be more focused on just trying to identify the highest, the optimal, the highest average projected lineup possible is what I would be looking to do. And I would play the same cash game lineup into all of my cash game contests, right? The main reason why in a GPP, you play a lot of different lineups and you diversify for a couple reasons. One is because it is difficult to quantify expected value. It's difficult to quantify what the actual best lineup is for a GPP. So by spreading out and diversifying, you in some ways give yourself an opportunity to hedge and to kind of to place more bets, right? But you also are trying to just diversify amongst like different outcomes, different conditions of the slate. In cash games, it's very easy to identify what the best overall lineup is, or like within a 1v1 or a 2v2 of a couple players, what overall the best lineup is. And your diversification, your risk tolerance comes in the form of playing different opponents. So you spread out and play more, you play a wider variety of opponents in your head-to-heads and things like that, which allows you to diversify and kind of manage your risk a little bit there. So for me, like playing cash games, my goal would basically just be, I would build just a single lineup. I probably don't even care how big the pool size is. I would probably be more focused on like, I might look at the top 5 optimals just to see, and pool size, could be, I don't know, 20 is probably plenty. 20 is plenty. And then I'm identifying, what lineup I actually want to take with me into my contests. But, and the other thing I should have mentioned, right? There is, this is an important point. Part of the other reason why I recommend playing a single lineup in cash games, but multiple lineups in GPPs is that there are a lot of lineups that are very close together in their expected value in GPP world, right? There are probably at least hundreds, probably thousands of good GPP lineups that all have very similar expected value to one another. In cash games, that the quality of a lineup falls off a cliff much quicker. Each projected point that you sacrifice as you move down into different cash game lineups is a much bigger sacrifice, right? So let's sort by projected score. So as we move down the list here, right, in a GPP, this lineup and this lineup and this lineup and this one are all probably going to have relatively similar expected values, which is why we talk about your entire pool of lineups is viable, right? And edit exposures until you're satisfied, right? It's because a lot of those lineups are somewhat interchangeable. In a cash game, right, we may find that, by lineup 1 has a projected score of 111, and lineup 20. Actually, tonight's not as good of an example of it because since there are a ton of lineups that are very close together. But I would say in general, you will find that, going from optimal 1 to optimal 20, there's a legitimate sacrifice in projected points that you don't want to necessarily accept just purely to diversify. So all of this to say, to answer this question specifically, I would probably use a single cash game lineup instead of building a bunch of different lineups. And I think for pool size, I don't think you need anything close to 500. I think 10 is probably fine for identifying that optimal. So. Cool. What other questions do we have here for today's show? Any other questions for me here today? we'll start to wrap up. If anybody else has any questions before the weekend here, fire away at me. I will mention, if you are watching or listening to the show for the first time and you haven't already signed up with SaberSim, or maybe you used to be signed up with SaberSim, you haven't been with us in a while, we have a free 7-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com. You can get signed up. You can use us for our tennis sims for the rest of Wimbledon here. You can play baseball DFS using our baseball sims. We have esports, all of the different sports available to you in that free 7-day trial. I don't see any other questions coming in here at the moment, so I think we will go ahead and leave it there for today. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Good luck tonight. Be careful with those weather games. Make sure you are paying attention and staying up to date with the news. Lots of games with some rain potential, some postponement potential here tonight. Have a good 4th of July weekend. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and I will see all of you on... Oh, we do have a couple other questions here. You guys got this right in at the last second here. Sean says, does SaberSim work with Yahoo? Yes, it does. And HC says, oh, this is a goofy one here. How many Coors Lights? We'll have a couple. We'll have a couple to celebrate Independence Day this weekend. So I saw that question flash up, and I thought that one was a DFS question, but instead we're talking beer drinking, which is okay. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there, guys. Have a good weekend. I will be right back here on Tuesday of next week, 2 p.m. Eastern, for the next episode of Office Hours. So until then, take care, good luck, and see you later.